Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Welcome to Spotlight on the Kohelet Policy Forum, how a far-right, US-funded Israeli think tank is working to shape policy and law in both the US and Israel. Jewish Currents is co-sponsoring today's conversation with the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you, Jewish Currents. Some housekeeping before we begin. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion among the panelists. I will moderate it. We will end at quarter of the next hour. It'll be about an hour and 15 minutes. We are recording and live streaming on Facebook. Everyone will be sent a copy. Everyone who registered for the webinar will be sent a copy of the recording after we finish. We are very eager to take your questions, so please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can do so at any time throughout the panel. And please keep an eye on the chat box. My colleagues at FMEP will be putting useful links and information into that box during the discussion. And finally, please note that we have enabled the closed captioning function so you can read the discussion. And now to begin. As Israel's far right has gained political influence and momentum, including the current government's plans for judicial reform, the Kohelet Policy Forum, a formerly low-profile, high-impact Israeli think tank, has been making headlines, increasingly making headlines. These headlines include articles in the New York Times and Haaretz and The Intercept. We're going to be posting these links. They're all going to be available on our website. Two key parts of this story are insufficiently understood and examined by the media. These are the ties between Kohelet and right-wing fellow travelers and funders in the United States, and also Kohelet's years-long efforts to influence policy and law, not only in Israel, but also in the United States, both at the state and federal level. So today we're holding a conversation among experts who have been researching and documenting the activities and funding of the Kohelet Policy Forum, including its transnational connections and the impact of its work in the US and in Israel-Palestine. I am truly delighted to be here today with four experts in this field who I'm going to introduce in alphabetical order. First, Ron Cohen. He's a media campaign and strategy consultant, as well as a social and political activist. He's the founder of the Democratic Bloc, which supports civil society organizations in Israel, including through media support and investigative research. Ron is a former director of Physicians for Human Rights, Israel. Lara Friedman is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She's a leading authority on the Middle East with particular expertise on US foreign policy in the region, on Israel-Palestine, and on the way Middle East and Israel-Palestine related issues play out in Congress and in US domestic politics, policies, and legislation. Yousef Munayyer is non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. He writes on the Arab-Israeli conflict and is a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He is widely published and holds a PhD in international relations and comparative politics from the University of Maryland. And Eran Nissan is the CEO of Mehazkim, which is a progressive digital movement that promotes the values, ideas, and solutions of the Israeli left. Prior to joining Mehazkim, Eran headed the Education and Advocacy Department at Peace Now. Eran holds a BA in Political Science and Philosophy from Ben-Gurion University and an MA in Emergency and Disaster Management from Tel Aviv University, and he is a certified dog trainer. So we're going to start with you, Eran. We're going to start with why we're talking about Kohelet now, about the regime change in Israel. So I want to ask you to start, what is the Kohelet Policy Forum? Where is it based? Broadly, what is its agenda? What is its vision for Israel as a society? And who are some of the major names and people associated with the organization?
So first of all, thank you very much for this platform. I think that it's an important conversation, and I will say that Ran and myself, we work together, we are colleagues, and we've been waiting for over 2 years that the Kohelet will be not a household name, but at least in the spotlight. So the Kohelet Policy Forum is the most influential organization in Israel today that influences the current Israeli government policies. And it's been published that the Kohelet Policy Forum orchestrated the judicial overhaul. It's a think tank, and I think that to just call it a think tank is to misrepresent what they're doing, because it's been more than a decade that Kohelet have been operating, and they're not the same strategy, they're not the same impact that maybe an American, even a very influential American think tank. They far exceeds the regular works of a think tank, research, legislative arm, position papers. What Kohelet Policy Forum are, they are the locomotive, the spear front of a bigger ecosystem of ultra-conservative, neoliberal, settlement Jewish supremacists that are leading a long-term ideological and political project to import the ideas of the fringes of the Republican Party, the talking points, the issues, the values, the ideas, and to combine them with the most right-wing, hardcore annexation arm in Israel. The Kohelet Policy Forum was established on January 2012, and in this decade, they reached maybe unprecedented power inside of the Israeli political system. Ran maybe can afterwards talk about what they've been doing in the past decades, but in this context, right now, we're talking about them because they are the ones that wrote the policies, the legislative initiative that are causing all the turmoil, the political crisis right now in Israel. Specifically, the ideas are something that to an American audience, just imagine the Koch brothers on steroids. That's the idea. Privatization of healthcare and education, annexation of the West Bank, an assault on unions and workers' rights. And right now we're talking about undermining the separation of power, the checks and balances in Israel's government. And their vision is something that is very radical, very extreme, very dangerous as I see it, but very foreign. It's something that to an Israeli ear is foreign. The ideas, the talking points are something that maybe are very, let's say, normal in the American political discourse. But right now, Kohelet are the ones that are leading the attack. They are the ones that are backing the politicians in Likud and in the settler right. And they're promoting not only the ideas, but they are the one that wrote the legislation. They are the one that give the support with cherry-picking research that turns into the campaign that the current coalition and government are leading. So we see them that they're well-funded, they're well-connected, they're very trained in leading these kinds of legislative projects in order to change Israel and to promote their vision that I mentioned before. I think I will stop now, and then we can go into the specifics of it later.
Terrific. Thank you. That was a great start. So talk to us about how you got interested in this work. Why did you start researching it? And maybe Ran, maybe you'll start with that question.
Yes, well, thank you again for inviting us for this conversation. Kohelet Forum has been active for the last decade or more, but yes, they've been active behind the scenes and in the shadow. But in the last few years, we could see their influence becoming more and more public. And I think that the peak of that was Pompeo's statement and the fact that the Secretary of State actually stood there and thanked personally Kohelet Forum. This is something that you usually you don't see these high-ranking politicians thanking an NGO, but he took the step and the attention to actually give them the credit for helping with promoting the Pompeo statement that is actually, let's say, stating that the settlements in the West Bank are not contradicting the international law and so on, which is a major change in American politics. So that was a red sign for us when we looked at the political environment in Israel and understanding how much Kohelet Forum is not discussed but is influential. You consider Pompeo, Netanyahu, and so on, together with people from Kohelet Forum standing on the same stage. And later on, a few months later, when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, we could again see how much Kohelet is influential in influencing the governmental policies around dealing with the pandemic, which part of it was bringing upfront ideas that were contradicting to any say Israeli social values, like canceling the minimum wage as part of dealing with the economical crisis that the pandemic brought, or exempting employers from paying social benefits, limiting financial assistance to families and workers, and so on. So Kohelet became more and more influential or out there, and that led us to look a little bit more deeper into their work and into their finances and donations as well. But also we need to remind ourselves that we are working here in a context where the left-wing camp is constantly attacked about its funding, about its activities, about its role, and so on, while the right wing, we know nothing about. It's working there without any criticism at all. And part of it was an attempt to actually go deeper and understand not only Kohelet Forum, but how does the right wing work in Israel, and where does it get its money from, and where do they get their agenda from, and where do they get the sources of influence, and so on. So yes, I think that we can put the Pompeo statement as the first sign that made us think that, okay, this is something that we should look deeper into. And we found, yeah, a bigger story than that.
Great, thank you. So the Pompeo statement was, if I'm not mistaken, that was 2019, and then COVID in 2020, and so it's been developing. So before we launch deeper into what's happening with the Israeli government right now and the plans and Kohelet's influence and part in that role, can you talk about how it has advanced its agenda up until this point in Israel? What are some of the laws and policies it has worked to enact? And what are some of the laws and policies it has worked also to block? Like, give us its first tier and its second tier priorities.
Yeah, I can start with the first tier a little bit, or just the highlights. So yeah, Pompeo Declaration is one thing, but we can also talk about the regulation law that actually tried to retroactively legalize Israeli settlements, and of course the nation state law, a law that was very controversial in Israel, polarizing between Arabs and Jews, between the right and the left, and so on, and is seen as a racist law that declares Israel as an exclusive Jewish state, and so on. So this is the first tier, the nation state law, the regulation law, and what we see today, the judicial coup that is happening, the override clause, the changing of the committee to appoint judges, the legal advisors law, and so on. These are the, let's say, the first and foremost, the most important issues that Kohelet is promoting on the political part. There are also economical issues that they're advancing, looking much more into privatization of education system, of healthcare, and so on. And I think maybe Eran could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we can see that throughout the years, Kohelet were working behind the scenes, and maybe that's one of the sources of their strength, because they weren't very keen on taking credit. And even in, so this project is, they would like us to call them conservatives. We don't call them conservative. This is too easy. This is frames the discussion in this conservative versus liberal, which is not in Israel. It's Jewish supremacists against the equality camp. But in the first conservative convention, or like the neocons of Israel convention, Moshe Koppel, an American-born, the founder and president of Kohelet, he stands there, and maybe he felt a little bit more too comfortable, and he said, like, these are the things that we're going to work. And one of the things, he said, we don't need to take credit. The credit goes to the politicians. If they mess it up, it's on them. If they succeed, they should take the credit. If we're not very minded on getting our logo and our signature and the credit on everything, we can get things done. And by doing that, they tied very close relationships.
Seem to have lost Eran for a moment.
Fact,
you're back. Eran, go back 2 sentences. We lost you for a second. You were talking about Kohelet
using
not taking
this
credit.
method. Yeah, so using this method of not taking credit allowed them to create very close relationships with Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar, with Ayelet Shaked and Nir Barkat, with Amir Ohana, and even now in this government with people like Bezalel Smotrich. The fact that they can provide the support system and also the campaign system. So in relations to what we're talking about right now, the attack, the assault on separations of power, and specifically on the Supreme Court, what the Kohelet Policy Forum and this ultra-conservative ecosystem, they identified the sources of left-leaning, or let's say more liberal and democratic institutions, or the power centers. So the academia, journalism or free press, the Supreme Court, civil society, and organized labor. And in the past decades, they directed their efforts in order to undermine each and every one of these power centers. So right now we see the Supreme Court as being the main thing in the conversation, but in the back we hear the Minister of Communications, Shlomo Karli, an extreme right-wing politician. He wanted to appoint a former high-ranking Kohelet researcher to be the director of the Ministry of Communications, to be the contractor to dismantle the broadcasting, but also free journalism. We can see yesterday, Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, directed his office to sue the Histadrut, the biggest and oldest workers' union in Israel, for threatening a strike last week as part of the resistance to this overhaul. And we can see efforts directed at all 5 of these power centers, and they do this by working top down, so with the politicians directly, providing legislation and the legal advice that they need and the policy papers and the support, but also bottom up. Kohelet has been pouring money into right-wing civil society to reorganize how the right wing in Israel operates. And this can be said on the pro-annexation, pro-settlements organizations. We can talk about how they co-opt the Forum for Civil Society, which is a right-wing knockoff of Shatil and IF, to provide capacity building operation for right-wing civil society, but also how they work to frame the discourse. And they frame the discourse as this confrontation between the elected representatives of the people and then the professional bureaucrats, the people that are the gatekeepers in the legal system, in the finance system, in civil society, because they are the obstacles on their way to annex the West Bank, to dismantle the welfare state, and do all the horrible things that we talked about before.
Maybe I'll just jump and add that we can also see now how, for example, the head of Kohelet legal department is now an official part of the negotiation, is a representative of the coalition in the negotiation between the coalition and the opposition around the judicial overhaul legislation. And there are only 4 representatives. He's one of them. A Kohelet researcher was appointed recently vice general director in the education ministry and so on. But more importantly, it's not just what they're doing, it's what they're not doing. And there are a few issues that Kohelet are a bit more careful with touching. And these are what they're calling Caesar issues. These are issues that are dividing between the right itself, between the right camp itself. And these are religion and state. This is an issue that Kohelet Forum is not touching. Abortions, not discussed at all. Moving from a people's army to a more professional army. This is also something that Kohelet is not doing. And legalization of prostitution or drugs. These are Caesar issues that are dividing among the right-wing camp, and this is where they don't do any work because they understand this is not for their benefit, at least for the moment.
And when you say religion and state, Ron, which issues are you referring to?
Whether it's the rabbinical courts and their role in Israel society, whether it's laws like even seen recently, or whether it is allowed to enter with chametz. Chametz is like bread in Pesach, in Passover to hospitals, dividing or dividing state and religion and so on. These are issues, whether public transportation will work on Saturday or not, whether women can be a part of rabbinical courts. Issues like that are issues that are dividing between the right-wing camp, and this is where they're not active or very minimalistic approach.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for.
Can I add just one thing that it's important to understand that the division of right-wing and left-wing in Israel is very, very unique. And when we imagine the potential base of Kohelet that these Caesar issues divide, on one hand, you have secular libertarian, like atheists, the don't tread on me crowd that we want like a Grover Norquist. I don't want to abolish government. I just want to make it small enough so I can drag it into the shower and drown it in the bathtub. Like we want a very, very small government. And on the other hand, you have the settler, hardcore, ultra-Orthodox community that they are very, very pro-annexation and pro-settlements. And just imagine something like expanding settlements. Expanding settlements could be a Caesar issue because it's to expand public spending, because we're doing public housing in the occupied territories. And one would have thought or could think that taking privately owned Palestinian land is something that would be ideologically problematic for someone who believes in liberty and personal rights. But the Kohelet Policy Forum, you said first tier, second tier, their annexationist settlement, messianic, ultra-Orthodox dream take precedence on their neoliberal economic right-wing libertarian ideas. So when you put them in a corner, you say, should we take privately owned Palestinian land and expand public spending of the government in order to build more settlements? They will say, Yes, it's not a problem for them because they prioritize this Jewish supremacy over the other stuff.
I thank you so much for all of that clarification, and I think that that's really important for our audience. If you listen to Moshe Koppel in his own words, he'll say we are both libertarian and conservative, and it seems confusing to imagine how a libertarian would want government to expand in the ways that they want government to expand and take control in terms of annexation and settlement. So you've presented that to us, and the priorities in terms of what their Jewish agenda is very clearly, and I appreciate that. I want to ask you one more question before we intentionally bring Lara and Yousef deeper into this conversation. Catch us, what is happening right now with the judicial reform? What is Kohelet's role in this regime change, judicial and legislative overhaul? Speak to us specifically about in what ways Kohelet is involved, please.
So Kohelet has been pushing this campaign for this very necessary changes to the judicial system for years now. They were one of the prominent voices talking about the need to weaken the Supreme Court, to create ways that the parliament, the Knesset, can override Supreme Court's judicial review. And we've seen them pushing it through videos, policy papers, conventions, but it all culminated on January 4th, where Yariv Levin, the newly appointed Minister of Justice, presented his first step of a three-step plan to change Israel's democracy, or to do a regime change. And he started his speech by thanking Aviad Bakshi from the Kohelet Policy Forum. So you see, again, we have an organization that is insisting on staying behind the scenes, but Michael Pompeo is spilling the beans, or Yariv Levin is spilling the beans, by saying, a lot of people worked on this thing, but I want to specifically thank the Kohelet Policy Forum or Aviad Bakshi. And this first step was consisted out of 4 different legislations that, due to a very successful and persistent public resistance and demonstrations and protests, 3 out of the 4 parts were suspended for now. And the 4th part, which is the most important one to Kohelet, to the coalition, but also to us, is the way that Israel appoints judges, and specifically Supreme Court judges. And this is very different than the United States. It's not a political, it's a different system, the parliamentarian system. And we had a committee that is consisted out of not only the opposition, the coalition, but also Supreme Court judges and members of the lawyers, like the Bar Association. And what this coalition is wanting to do is to take over, to make the process of selecting judges to be purely political, and give the government almost total control on the selection of judges. And just to understand how dangerous this is, in Israel, we don't have separation of powers. The executive branch, the government, is sitting inside of the legislative branch, the parliament, the Knesset. The fact that a lot of the ministers are also members of Knesset means that this is one branch. And if you give the government / coalition, the parliamentarian majority, also total control on the selection of judges, you mean that you don't have separation of power at all. You don't have checks and balances. Kohelet are the architects of this thing. So I will tie it with like the image or the metaphor. We've been talking on running over the Supreme Court with D9, with a big tractor. This was like the image, because it was a right-wing politician that says that we need to run over the Supreme Court. Now, a regular think tank might have said, yes, the Supreme Court should be demolished with the use of a tractor. But Kohelet, because they're heavily funded, because they're deeply connected, because they have also standing in the right-wing conservative media, they're not just saying we need to demolish the court. They are the ones that are paying for the tractor. They are the one that trained the driver of the tractor. They are the ones that make sure that there is a positive campaign in the media, reviewing how it's important, how it's the best thing to demolish the Supreme Court with this tractor. And they are the ones that will hold hands with the politicians on the ruins of the Supreme Court and with it, Israel democracy, and applaud themselves about what a nice job we've done.
Thank you. Speaking of that funding, speaking of their deep pockets, Yousef, I want to turn to you. Can we talk about the U.S. role, both with respect to the leadership of Kohelet Policy Forum and to its funding?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a number of different ties here that connect folks, at Kohelet to the United States and individuals in the United States and activities in the United States. The founder, of course, of Kohelet, Moshe Koppel, is an American from New York who moved to Israel. Of course, in the New York Times story, he claims that Kohelet is the brains behind the Israeli right wing. If anyone has been looking for the brains behind the Israeli right wing for some time, we've found them now. He also insists, as has been mentioned, on working quietly and without getting credit, which I think is very important, and I'll return to that later. Eugene Kantorovich, of course, who's a director at Kohelet, moved to the United States as a child from Ukraine, and then later moved to Israel in 2013. Although I believe he lives or has lived in a settlement in the West Bank. He's, of course, active transnationally. He was a major force behind unconstitutional anti-BDS legislation. And he's also tied to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, where he's been listed as a fellow. And the JCPA, the Jerusalem Center, is a nexus of individuals who've cooperated closely, of course, with the Israeli government's global repression efforts against Palestine activism, many of them working in Israel, but also in the United States at different times. Another connection is through a fellow named Jerome Marcus, who's a fellow at the Kohelet Forum, and he's involved in a US-based lawfare organization called the Deborah Project. Marcus was also the attorney that represented Donald Trump in an election lawsuit in Pennsylvania, again in Pennsylvania in November 2020. And going deep down the rabbit hole several years, he's also known for having been the person who tipped off Ken Starr many years ago about Monica Lewinsky's relations with President Bill Clinton in January of 1998. So politically, these folks are very much on the right. Many of them have connections for years with the US-based Federalist Society, a major force within right-wing politics here in the United States. The funders, the reported funders, Arthur Danchik and Jeffrey Yaz, are important to kind of pay attention to here. Yaz, of course, is a Pennsylvania-based right-wing billionaire and mega donor to right-wing causes and ideology. His donations have fueled groups here in the United States and many of them locally in Pennsylvania that have worked on union busting, banning abortion and the so-called critical race theory, fighting against climate regulation, really a wide range of sort of right-wing activities. He's also a major donor to something called the Club for Growth, alongside Richard Uihlein, which is a 501c4 that backs Republican candidates. Uihlein has also been reportedly connected through financing with several groups that were implicated in the January 6th insurrection at Capitol Hill. Danchik is a partner with Yaz in this Susquehanna International Group, which is their joint business, and together they do philanthropic giving through something called the Claus Foundation. This foundation supports a range of right-wing and libertarian causes and also right-wing Zionist groups. It's a U.S.-based 501c3, and so is something called the American Friends of Kohelet. But despite the transparency required of such groups in the U.S., Claus does not appear to directly fund American Friends of Kohelet, but people should check out the Haaretz reporting on how those connections do exist. Instead, and this is so common in this universe of giving for these causes, it likely passes through pass-throughs like donor-advised funds. For example, the 990s, the tax returns of the Claus Foundation and American Friends of Kohelet do show connections if you dig deep enough. And Claus, for example, gave to a donor-advised fund called Fidelity Investments Charitable Trust. And the way these funds work is, they'll take your money and they'll essentially direct them to where you want them to go. And they act as a kind of cover for these activities so that donors can support causes that they don't necessarily want to be tied to publicly. And you can look in some of the years in which the Claus Foundation gave to Fidelity. Fidelity gave similarly large amounts in those same years to American Friends of Kohelet, which of course then passes on the funds to the Kohelet Forum in Israel. This is actually super common and goes against the very principles of transparencies that these organizations, these 501c3 organizations, are supposed to adhere to. Last, I would just say, after the Haaretz expose, it's understood that the funding mechanism shifted to something called the Central Fund of Israel, which, despite the name, is actually not based in Israel, but is based in New York. It's a US-based, again, 501c3. And this is very much a black hole, when it comes to the funneling of money to Israel for many right-wing Zionist organizations, including in many settlements. And this acts as a central pass-through for many philanthropists who want to support some of these right-wing causes, but do not necessarily want to take the credit or have the credit assigned to them, which brings us back to this principle of sort of secrecy or behind the scenes support. So these connections are, of course, significant, and there are many of them. And these are actors that are working really in the United States and in Israel, and oftentimes doing so very seamlessly, as if there is no geographic divide.
Thank you, Yousef. That was so thorough and terrific to have it all in one place for you to lay all of that out for us. So thank you. And Lara, I'm going to ask you in a moment to talk to us about the politics and the legislative links. But before we do that, I want to follow up on one thing that Yousef just said about the funding, not taking credit, and also there being some murkiness around what is funded and who is doing the funding. And Eran, I wanted to ask you to speak to that issue specifically around the funding and some of the lack of clarity around understanding how the funding is working.
Yeah, so the two names that are being repeated and tied to Kohelet were Jeffrey Yass and Arthur Danchik that Yousef mentioned. But in the recent New York Times article, there's this attempt to distance Yass from Kohelet. But what we know, and this is an interpretation of how we see things, what defines the Kohelet Policy Forum work is misdirection and smokescreens, the use of smokescreens to the real agenda, to the way they operate, but also the sources of the funding. And we see Yass and Danchik as bad faith actors that built this elaborate mechanism in order to keep them anonymous. But we see that Yass and Danchik, in many, not only in their business endeavors, but also their philanthropic endeavors, they operate in many times as one economical unit. And the fact that Jeffrey Yass is in hot water for various issues on American politics does not mean that they're not working together, that they're not coordinated, that they're not pushing the same vision. And it's important to understand that unlike people like Sheldon Adelson, or maybe other entrepreneurs or businessmen that maybe have economic interests, so this corruption mechanism, what we see with Yass and Danchik, that it's pure ideology. We're talking about people that sits on the board of the Institute for Justice and the Cato Institute, that they are aligned with the Koch brothers, that they are giving money to campaigns to promote this libertarian extreme right-wing ideas. And this alliance, this ultra-conservative alliance, is something that we need to look and maybe think about where we can build not just the opposition, but the alternative. What can we do to strengthen the alliance among liberal forces and progressive forces and this camp that strives for equality and peace and the dismantling of systems of oppression and injustice that the Kohelet Policy Forum with their friends across the Atlantic are promoting?
Thank you so much, Eran. Lara, so I want to ask you, this transatlantic alliance that Eran and Yousef and Eran have laid out for us, talk to us about specifically focusing on the US. What are the laws and the policies that Kohelet or individuals or organizations that are associated with them that they're working to see adopted and enacted in the US and on both the federal and the state levels?
Sure, and thank you, and thanks to everyone else on this webinar. It's really a rich discussion. I do want to just very quickly pick up on the funding question, one piece of it, and if folks listen to or watch the interview with Moshe Koppel that he did at the 10-year anniversary, which I think was put into the chat, there's a really telling moment at the end when the interviewer asks about the funding and who the funders are, and he says, well, we respect the privacy of our funders, which is really rich coming from an organization which led the effort in Israel to pass a law that effectively says the left has to say its funders or it proves that they're foreign agents. It's a really quite a gutsy statement. In terms of the U.S. side of it, look, like Eran and Ron, I mean, like, I'm really happy to see people talking about Kohelet. I think myself and Yousef and others who work on the U.S. side of laws targeting the Israel-Palestine issue have been paying attention to Kohelet for a long time and wishing other people would. I first became aware of Kohelet back in 2014, 2015, when a guy named Eugene Kantorovich suddenly burst on the scene. And from my perspective, he seemed to be everywhere. He was writing in the Washington Post articles effectively arguing in favor of, whatever Israel did was legal under international law, and here's why. And he and I sparred a bit in print on the question of whether or not the US should effectively erase the Green Line and treat settlements as no different from Israel during the Obama era. His argument was, of course, that yes, they should, and that Obama was wrong to not treat settlements as part of Israel. But then, you sort of see this, develop. And I want to be clear for people who are listening, the interesting thing with Kohelet Forum is while they're not big at self-promotion, they're very much on the record. So it's not really like you shouldn't attribute intent. I'm very much against attributing intent to anyone, but I am in favor of taking them at their word. So for instance, Yousef mentioned US laws, laws that have been found unconstitutional by numerous courts. Supreme Court declined to rule, but at this point, they're still considered unconstitutional in numerous courts. Eugene Kantorovich has publicly taken credit for this legislation. I pulled up his bio that he submitted when he testified in Congress in 2015. And in the bio, it said, Professor Kantorovich also plays a leading role in the drafting of laws about Israel boycotts in US states. So it's not some conspiracy to say there's this role. Whether he does it in the name of himself or the universities he's working for at the time or Kohelet Forum, it's him, and he is the director of the international law program at Kohelet Forum, and he is effectively claiming, and I believe him, to be a key, if not the lead drafter in legislation, which is now spread across the majority of US states, seeking to quash free speech of American citizens, or he would argue quashing to completely legally bar them from boycotting things that Israel doesn't want boycotted. And he's testified in Congress. Just to be clear, in terms of impact, testifying in Congress is a big deal. Most of us have never testified in Congress, or if we do, it will be a rare thing. Groups like the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, FDD, during the Trump era were constantly in Congress. Okay, Eugene Kantorovich testified in Congress 8 times between 2015 and 2020, and seemed to be out there laying out policy recommendations that were reflective of the Israeli government view and that were generally adopted and articulated by Republicans on every issue you can think of. And this included attacking the Palestinians. It included mobilizing against BDS and calling for legislation against BDS. He testified twice on the need to move the embassy to Jerusalem and why the Obama administration was violating US law. And for instance, on the sovereignty in the Golan. And this really, there's a very direct line between this legislation, it would seem to me, and Secretary of State Pompeo in 2020 declaring the Pompeo Doctrine at a Kohelet Policy Forum event. So there's the very strong U.S. side of this, which is, now that the world is suddenly paying attention to Kohelet in Israel, I think they maybe are missing the story in the U.S., which is that while Kohelet has quietly been enormously active and effective, let's give them credit, tremendously effective in Israel at shaping the political currents to where we are today. In the US, they have played, I would say, a parallel, enormously effective and quiet role of shaping US policy to where it is today when it comes to anything related to Israel-Palestine. And this is something that is, I think, again, whenever we talk about outside influence, there's nothing illegal about this. I mean, you can like it or dislike it. This is how the game is played. They've played it enormously effectively. The fact that they've played it without any real scrutiny is, I think, something that is maybe of more interest. The last thing I'll say here, and this speaks to the broader agenda. Obviously, I focus on the Israel-Palestine piece of the agenda. I would encourage people, if they're trying to understand who Kohelet is in the US and how it relates to Israel, to look at CPAC. I mean, there's two things. One, the model of how they operate in the US parallels how they operate in Israel, which is similar, in my view. The thing it is most similar to is ALEC, right? The American Legislative Exchange Council. Again, going back to Moshe Koppel's interview, he talks about why they're so effective. And he's clear, it's not just that we have great ideas and great policy papers, we talk to politicians. No, we come with draft legislation. And that is the model that they have also followed. I don't want to say replicated. I don't want to say which came first. They've certainly followed that model in the US to great effect. But I would also say look at CPAC. And most tellingly, I would say look at Eugene Kontorovich's appearance at CPAC in, I think it was 2022, when CPAC was held in Hungary, in Budapest for the first time. And listen to him as he describes a worldview. And it is a worldview where railing against wokeism, railing against recycling. I mean, there's a great line in there where he rails against the having different colored bins to put your garbage in, fits in seamlessly with the Israel's rights to the land, or the entire anti-woke agenda linked to the Judeo-Christian Jewish supremacy agenda, which says that what Israel is doing is right and just, and if you are part of this overarching anti-woke, I'm going to use that language, agenda, and supporting Israel as a piece of it. And honestly, that video is something that everyone should watch.
Thank you, Lara. So, Yousef, talk to us a little bit more. Lara just laid all of this out to us from a policy perspective, but can you focus specifically around the issues of free speech and activism when it comes to Palestinian rights and in Israel also, and look at the role of Kohelet as it relates to that broader story?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all of the things that we've discussed today, there were two elements that really, to me, seemed to be very common with a lot of what we see in so many of the efforts to target free speech and activism on this issue. One of them is around sort of the shadowy giving and the lack of transparency in finances. And the other is this idea of, not wanting to take credit or standing in the background of certain activities. This reminded me very much of something that the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which of course was the Israeli government agency tasked with going after the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, called the no logo policy. And it was a principle in which they operated under. And the idea here was that they did not want to have their logo, they did not want to have their branding, they did not want to be taking credit for the activities that were silencing dissent for a couple reasons. Because number one, it wouldn't really look good to have a government taking credit for these activities, but also because they didn't want to complicate the relationships they had with their partners who did not necessarily want to be seen as working directly with a government to achieve these outcomes. Interestingly enough, a fellow at the Kohelet Forum was formerly an official at the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and he's written extensively on how Israeli foreign affairs should be reformed, including around the fight on BDS. But this no logo policy was one of the reasons why the Ministry of Strategic Affairs created something called Concert, which many of the viewers and listeners might be familiar with. And this was a public benefit corporation, which essentially was put together so that you can have this plausible deniability, so that you can have actors receiving money from one entity without necessarily having to be seen as connected to it. Mr. Koppel might say it's because they respect the privacy of their donors. The Ministry of Strategic Affairs said it's because they don't want the notion that these finances are connected to these activities to become public knowledge. And of course, one of the main funders, if not the largest funder behind Concert, and we know this from their audited financial statements, was the Central Fund for Israel. Once again, the place where everybody seems to go to funnel money to stuff that they don't want to be associated with in Israel. I agree with Lara that it's ironic that Kohelet is entangled in so much of this, because Koppel's political project prior to founding the Kohelet Policy Forum was drafting legislation at the time with the Likud MK, Michael Eitan, that required Israel-based NGOs to report funding they received from entities abroad. But of course, this was tailored to target human rights NGOs, which receive funds from European government foundations, and not right-wing groups like Kohelet and others who raise massive funds from right-wing US philanthropists. Eitan said at the time of the bill, when there is a political debate in Israel in which bodies funded by a foreign country participate, it's important that the public know who's behind them and who is funding the activity. So yes, that sounds very rich today, and it sounds hypocritical. But importantly, I think in some ways, while this might seem like hypocrisy and a double standard, within a particular worldview, it is perfectly consistent. And I think that's what's important to understand here. If you think, as Kohelet does, who's behind the nation state bill, that Israel is a state for the Jewish people, and importantly here, not the citizens of Israel, but the Jewish people, donations that come from right-wing, pro-Israel, Zionist, Jewish philanthropists in the United States are still coming from within that polity, are still coming from within that group. But donations from European governments are not. And so, I think when it comes to transparency and democracy and pluralism, this is obvious hypocrisy. But within the worldview that they ascribe to, they don't see anything wrong with this. And I think this is part of the fundamental debate that's playing out within Israel today. Who gets to decide the direction of this country, right? Who gets to decide the policies of the state? And for Israelis in the streets, it's primarily a debate between secular Israelis and religious ones. And of course, the people most affected, Palestinians, are left out altogether. But among Israeli Jews, this is, I think, the central debate, and it intersects a lot with what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Yousef, and thanks for summing it up in that with such clarity for us in that way. Lara, I wanted to ask you if there's anything you want to comment on what Yousef said.
Yeah, a couple of things on the no labels thing, which I think is, or the no logos thing. I think it's worth noting that in the U.S., the main face of the I'll talk about the Tikva Fund in a second. The main face of Kohelet Forum in the U.S. is Eugene Kantorovich, and he sometimes notes Kohelet Fund in his bio or bio blurb, and sometimes he doesn't. I think what people, here's an example. So some years back, Eugene moved from, I think he was at Northwestern University. Don't don't quote me on that, whichever one of those, you can find it in his bio. He moved from there to George Mason. And there's in the Scalia Center, there's a law program, an international law program that he runs. It's his program. And the name Kohelet Forum is not associated with it directly. And if you read his short bio blurb on that program, which he runs, it's not on there. You have to click through for his CV to see it. But there's 2 staff members on that program. One is Eugene Kantorovich, and the other one is Jerome Marcus, who Yousef talked about earlier. That program is effectively an arm of the Kohelet Forum in the US, operating without logos as a legal expert voice, weighing in mainly on issues related to Israel, Palestine, and weighing in from a pretty predictable place. There's no logos on that, right? And Eugene, is, again, I got to give credit where credit is due. He is an enormously prolific thinker and writer and speaker. On the Hill 8 times over the course of whatever it was, the number of times he has testified is extraordinary for someone on an issue like this. The number of articles he's had, if you Google him, effectively what he's created is a profile of himself as a law professor expert on this. Kohelet isn't part of that blurb, and it's been enormously effective. There's some questions in the chat box about connections to Christian evangelicals, to Tikva Fund. I would encourage people to just Google, because you can see a lot of this yourself. The main connection right off the bat is that Eugene, or Professor Kantorovich, let's say, with respect, Professor Kantorovich is cited constantly. He is constantly speaking and writing and being used as an expert validator on positions to the far right, on Jewish supremacy, on annexation, on Jerusalem, on anti-Semitism, all of the issues that you would expect Kohelet Forum to be weighing in on. He is the expert weighing in as Eugene Kantorovich, the expert. And that's across the board. There are ideological affinities there. I would also say if you watch the CPAC in Hungary conference and you see the entire framing of the panel he's on is about God. It's about, agreeing under God. You should check it out. The part about the Tikva Fund, and here I'm just going to, we'll put a link in the chat. I think there's an article in Times of Israel. And here's what the Times of Israel article says. The Tikva Fund has long-standing ties to Kohelet, has made hefty donations to the think tank. The chairman of Kohelet, Moshe Kopel, is on Tikva's board of directors, receives an annual salary of $15,000 from Tikva as of 2019, the last year for which they have filings. Kopel has written about legislation on the Times, that's separate. Other staff have also moved between the 2 organizations. So I'll just leave it there, except to say, the Tikva Fund, the Shiloh Forum, which I think is closely rated. You have an ecosystem of organizations that have shared ideologies, that have interlocking staff, funders, boards of directors, and political allies. And that isn't unique, right? That's part of being an effective ecosystem doing what you want to do politically. Again, I would reference this CPAC event where one of the people on stage, not Eugene, makes a comment that the left has always said there's a vast right-wing conspiracy, we need to give it to them. And then he laughs, he says, no, but seriously, and then the audience cheers. But I mean, it's not conspiratorial to observe that these very strong links exist across an ecosystem of organizations that have a shared set of values and a shared set of objectives. And all of those values don't have to overlap perfectly, and all of those objectives don't have to overlap perfectly. Some of these are allies of convenience, and you see that across every ecosystem, every political ecosystem. In this case, I think that the reason we're talking about it today is both because it's extraordinarily effective and because people don't seem to know about it or haven't known about it. And that's on both sides of the ocean.
Thank you, Lara. That was so clear and important and useful to put all of that together. And it brings us back a little bit to what Eran and Ron were talking about earlier when they talked about the scissor issues. These are the issues that they won't work on because this would split the people who have come together and the things that unite them. As you said, here and there, people are working on the things, the issues, the ideologies that actually unite them and bring them together. They don't have to agree on everything. Lara, you just talked about an ecosystem of organizations. I think you're talking about what Haaretz actually called the tentacles of the Kohelet Policy Forum. And I wanted to ask Eran and Ran, or Lara and Yousef, also feel free to weigh in. If you wanted to name any more of those tentacles and any more of the ways that that Kohelet is working, as Lara said, in many ways on the record, but without taking credit or using this phrase "no logo," not putting their logo on it.
So yes, I mean, there are a few examples that we can give. Lara mentioned one. This is the Shiloh Policy Forum, and this is a forum that is dealing exclusively with promoting settlements, annexation of the West Bank, and so on. And this has been established directly by Kohelet Forum, and the leaders are former researchers of Kohelet Forum, and they've been playing a major role also in Pompeo Declaration and so on. And we can also see today that they are moving from dealing just with the West Bank and working in small steps also in the Galilee and so on when it comes to Jewish settlements. So it's not only beyond the Green Line, but also inside Israel. We can see the work in education in Israel, or their attempts to privatize education. So organizations or attempts that are called, for example, the Coalition for Autonomy in Education. This is an Israeli coalition. We can see the connections of Kohelet Forum and the fact that some of the members there are coming from Kohelet Forum. Next Generation is another NGO. It's Parents for Choice in Education. And the people who established that are Kohelet researchers from the education field. But again, you can see Parents for Education, Coalition for Autonomy. It's all about privatizing a public system. So we can see the Shiloh Forum, we can see education. A few years ago, Israel was dealing a lot with a movement called Ani Shulman. That was basically a movement of small businesses, freelancers, and so on, fighting for their rights. And we could see also how Kohelet Forum had a connection there. And basically one of their leaders was later elected to the Knesset. MK Abir Kara is no longer a Knesset member, but he was there, and he was adopted by Kohelet Forum very, very quickly. Again, so these are a few examples, and I'm sure Eran can give more, but as I said before, it's not just about organizations, it's also about specific people that are going into or getting like these major positions, whether it's in, for example, today the legal advisor of MK Rothman, he's the head of the Constitution and Law Committee. This is the committee that is promoting, and this is where the discussion about the judicial reform is happening. The legal advisor has been a researcher in Kohelet Forum and has been, I think he left only a few months ago. I'm not sure about that. As I mentioned, Aviad Bakshi, the head of the legal department, is now part of the negotiation team of the coalition and so on. So yeah, these are a few examples of their arms dealing with other issues.
Thank you.
I can add that first of all, we see a classic astroturfing campaign. This is a method that is being employed by Kohelet constantly, that we can see dozens of organizations. It's not only building the practice of building a front organization in order to try to mask your message and agenda as something that is spontaneous and organic and coming like a grassroots. And the examples that Ran gave around education are the most apparent, that you see when you go and you do even the scratching the surface of an organization that has a logo in this Coalition for Autonomy in Education. You see that the organization is listed in the Kohelet Forum office's address, and 100% of its employees are Kohelet researchers. And when they are going to interview or they publish an op-ed, they say, I'm just a concerned mother. that I want to promote autonomy in education, but she's a full-time Kohelet researcher. I will also add that we talked about being pragmatic or being like outcome oriented, and a lot of the things that Kohelet are promoting were over a decade in the works. So not that just the nation law bill, but also the judicial overhaul. They have been planning this, and they can look and say, it doesn't matter this time around. We have this ball rolling. And at the end, we're going to annex the West Bank, and it's going to take 5 years or 10 years. And that this way of thinking ahead and long term is something that we can also adopt in our work, but also that it's important to note that it's not about this round. It's about the entire discourse that they're dragging to the right. And the other thing is that they were very pragmatic up until the first Kohelet Haaretz expose. So up until 2 years, they were looking ways to work with Yesh Atid and Benny Gantz, and even to try and look neutralize about promoting free market ideas and like under disguise of neutrality. And that's why the Shiloh Forum, they created this straw organization to distance themselves from controversial issues inside of Israeli political discourse. But because of the campaign that Ran, that myself, that our colleagues and partners and allies here, but also the United States have been running in dragging the Kohelet Policy Forum into the limelight and exposing their agenda, we actually effectively pushed them to the right. We pushed them to the fringes because we made sure that the politicians and parties that claim to be on our side, they cannot cooperate with people like the Kohelet Policy Forum. And that caused them to tie relationships and alliances with Itamar Ben-Gvir, with Bezalel Smotrich. And I think that this just shows the power and the importance of discourse, and the fact that we have 150 people here, the fact that maybe some of us or most of us will tomorrow sit in a Seder dinner and to talk about the Kohelet Policy Forum, the importance of raising the issues, the controversy, not only the problems with Kohelet Policy Forum, their agenda, their funders, their vision, but also where is our responsibility in creating an alternative, in creating a progressive, liberal, equality-seeking and equality-striving alliance between American progressives and Israeli progressives, and see how we can direct our resources and our efforts into a political, concrete, pragmatic, but also an ideological outcome.
If I could just weigh in, and just to say, as the Foundation for Middle East Peace, we're not pushing for any political, this is no lobbying, not organizing, this is informational, educational. I would say that at this moment, I think it's also valuable. The reason people are paying attention to Kohelet today is because of the judicial reform. And this is something I can say from my family, my friends, is there's a lot of energy around this idea of quote unquote saving Israel's democracy, right? I think it's really useful for people. I get that people don't want, a lot of people want to have a very simple, straightforward goal. They see this objective as something that's achievable, of saving Israel's democracy, quote unquote, by saving the Supreme Court, and don't want to have that hopeful picture of victory muddied by talking about things like Jewish supremacy and Palestinians. But the fact is, that is part of the story, right? You really, when Peter Beinart gets and not a great reception speaking over the weekend at a park in New York, when he says this, and they're like, don't mess up our nice protest by mentioning the Palestinians. This is progressives. I think we need a corrective. Part of that corrective is reminding people that the forces behind what you're unhappy with right now with the Supreme Court, their agenda isn't just trying to get more control over gay rights and women's rights and the economy and education. The overarching goal, and Moshe Koppel is very clear about this when he talks about the organization, and Eran and Ran, mention this when you listen to them lay out his priorities, why he created the Kohelet Forum in the first place. His number one issue is Jewish supremacy. He doesn't use that term, but he's saying unapologetically a Jewish state for the Jews. And you establish this organization because you see the government walking away from that. You can listen to Kohelet in different environments, them talking about the dangers of what they see as a post-Zionist educational system in Israel. It's not prioritizing teaching children about Jewish supremacy and the righteousness of Jewish supremacy. It's in this secular Western, what they see as post-Zionist. That's what they have to fight. Fundamentally, this battle over the courts is a battle for whether or not there is going to be a Jewish supremacist state, or what they fear is a state that's increasingly about equality, not just within the Green Line and not just for Jewish Israelis, but for everybody. So I think it's a really important corrective. Understanding Kohelet and its motives is an important corrective. And it should be an important corrective also for all the politicians across the political spectrum who view the experts, and let's call it experts in what they are, that are speaking on behalf of Kohelet, often without logos, particularly in the United States, and presenting themselves as subject matter experts when actually they're advocates. And they have every right to speak as advocates, but they have to be understood as advocates of a very specific worldview that, probably is something that, unless you are an Orban-friendly right-winger in Europe or the US, it's probably a view that is antithetical to what you believe on everything, except maybe you've made an exception on Israel, which means maybe that's a good sign that you need to look in the mirror and examine what you're getting into.
Thank you, Lara, for summing up our whole webinar just there, and for the mic drop. As we're coming to a close, I just want to ask Ran and Yousef if there's any, and Eran, if there's anything final you want to say to our audience. Ran, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, Lara summed it up perfectly, but I'll just add that we need to understand that the political project of Kohelet and the fact what they're leading is an attempt to reshape Israel and to reshape the Israeli right in an image that is similar to the Republican fringe, American Republican fringe in many, many ways. And part of what they're doing, and I think that people in Israel are more concerned with that than with Palestinians and so on. And this is our work, of course, to help people understand the bigger picture. But people are feeling that what Kohelet is doing is attacking the social values of Israel, the solidarity between people, the mutual commitment between people to help each other. I mean, it might be a little bit, when it comes to American audience, so talking about a universal healthcare or universal education is something that is not natural. But in Israel, it's a value. It's a natural thing. This is part of the security web and the solidarity between people. And I think that part of what makes people so angry about Kohelet and talking about them so much is understanding that what's attacked is the solidarity between citizens and the commitment between them. And this is important to understand it because this is a way to talk. If we want to talk to the hearts of people, we need to find a way to help them understand that. And it's not always by talking first about supremacy or about Palestinians. It's talking about the social values and moving from there to the bigger picture, which is the important one. I agree. And there's a long way to go until people could see the entire picture of what this political project is all about.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Eran. Thank you, Lara. Yousef, I'm going to give you the last word.
I think just in closing, what I would say is we must focus on the reason why groups like Kohelet are behind these kinds of the overhauls to the judiciary system, why they're so fundamentally opposed to the principle of equality being enshrined in law. And that's because they have a specific agenda about what is supposed to happen in Israel and Palestine, what is supposed to happen between the river and the sea. They have an agenda focused on annexation. They have an agenda focused on a particular understanding of what it means to be Jewish that has obviously alienated a very significant portion of the Israeli population. But the primary victims of this agenda are Palestinians. And it's important to understand that just as Kohelet and their allies value the transnational nature of an alliance for change, so too must those who oppose these policies and want to stand up to them and for the rights of Palestinians. We must do the same and act likewise.
Thank you, Yousef. Eran, Lara, Yousef, thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you for your deep dives into this topic, for being so obsessed and seeing the importance and the urgency of mastering all of this information and these connections and digging underneath the surface and coming here today to present all of this to us. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our listeners for being here also, and also to remind you that we have shared a lot of material, a lot of links. Everything everyone talked about today is deeply backed up in newspaper reports, in 990s, in a lot of investigative journalism and research. Also, Eran's organization, Mehazkim, has put out great videos on Kohelet that I really recommend everyone watch. There's both in Hebrew with English subtitles and a new updated one just released 2 weeks ago in English. All of this information is available. Everyone who is listening today will get a link to the recording of this video and all the links that we've shared today. So please know that that's coming to you and you can share it, pass it on, pass it wide. Thank you so much for the questions you asked. We got a lot of questions in our Q&A today and we wove them in, tried to weave all of them in, and we will continue to use your questions, the listeners' questions, to guide the conversations that we will hold in the future. And I want to welcome everyone to check back at the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for a list of all of the resources that we've been talking about, also all of our other events and announcements of upcoming events, webinars, and podcasts. Thank you all. Eran, Lara, Yousef, thank you again. Thank you to our listeners. Until next time, thanks so much.